This online lecture is intended to provide you with a broad overview of early modern architecture, architecture that was produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in America as well as Europe. Early modern architecture reflected the same debates that other art forms were engaging in that we've been looking at, basically coming down to industrialization. Some people arguing that it was beneficial, other people arguing that it was a detriment to humanity. The people that thought that industrialization was a bad thing turned to the past. And we get this with the architecture that is built in what is known as the revivalist style. Revivalism means bringing back historical forms of architecture, rejecting the innovation of modernity for the familiarity of the traditional. The past was used in the design of public structures as a way to celebrate national and cultural accomplishments as well. For those who thought industrialization was a good thing, we're seeing significant gains being made in architectural design. We see the use of industrial materials, things like steel, iron, and glass, that allow for buildings to do things structurally that had never been done before. We see much innovation because new types of structures are being built as well, things like railroad stations and department stores, structures that had functions that did not have any sort of precedence in the history of architecture. Now here's an example of one of these revivalist approaches to architecture. These are the Houses of Parliament located in London, England. This is a civic structure, houses the Parliament, where the two Houses of Parliament in the United Kingdom come together to conduct government business. This structure is the largest parliament structure in the world. This is crazy. 1,200 rooms, 100 staircases, and 2 miles of corridor. The structure was built in the style of Gothic Revival. Gothic Revival was a style of architecture that was thought of as a purer product of society. This purity is coming from the style's strong affiliation with the Christian religion. It was felt that the purity of the architecture reflected the good and true nature of government. The Gothic style began in the 12th century, and it was another time of architectural innovation. Architects were working to create innovative approaches to design that would allow for churches to be taller than ever before. It also was a time of ornate design in the later part of the style, which is also reflected here. Lots of fancy stuff going on. The large size of the structure in some ways echoes the idea behind the large structures of the Gothic period. This idea being that this is almost like a temple of the modern age, except it's a secular temple for the English government. Now here's another structure that is also coming out of England, but this is one that's more akin with the innovation approach to architecture at this time. So this is a structure that is made from cast iron, which is an industrial material, and this structure was prefabricated. So what that means is that the materials used to construct the structure were made in a factory, and then they were brought to site and essentially assembled. And what happens is when you prefabricate a structure, it allows for the structure to be built very quickly. This structure was constructed in only 16 weeks. That's pretty crazy. And it was a large structure, 108 feet high, covering 17 acres. This was built in 1851 as part of the World's Fair, which was this gathering of different countries from around the world, and they were showcasing their country's innovations in technology. So the World's Fair is even a testament to industrialization. The Crystal Palace, as you can see in these drawings, consisted of an iron skeleton with many arches and frames, which was an essential part of both the design and the aesthetics, what it looked like. And then you can see it creates this skeleton that was covered with huge plate glass panels. So this is very innovative, this idea that you can have a structure that's so strong that you don't need walls to bear the weight, and that the walls instead could be made of glass. The architect, Sir Joseph Paxton, cited his inspiration for the structure as a leaf, the slender skeleton of its natural form. That a leaf has those strong, hard parts in them, and that gives the structure of the softer parts. It proved his argument that if structuring of the building was strong, that it did not need the walls to bear the weight of the roof. And again, this is a huge development in the realm of architecture. Now we're looking at drawings because the Crystal Palace no longer exists. It was moved after it was constructed for the World's Fair, at the time called the Great Exhibition, and it stayed there until it was heavily damaged by a fire, and at that time it had served as a museum and a concert hall, and then unfortunately it was demolished in 1941 during World War II. Now here's another example of this innovative approach, but this is by the architect Louis Sullivan, who is an American architect. Many people call him the father of modern American architecture, and I would agree with that. He really does revolutionize architecture with the development of the skyscraper. Now I know that this building here doesn't look like a crazy super tall skyscraper, but during this time, pretty tall building. Now, we saw that with the Crystal Palace, there was the use of cast iron as a building material, and this encouraged the development of steel frame architecture. So Sullivan is using steel rather than cast iron. It's a stronger material, it's less expensive, and it's more resistant to fire and rust, and that's what allowed for the development of the skyscraper. We see steel first being used in architecture in the late 19th century. So what happens is the steel is used to create skeletal structures, kind of like the skeletal structure we saw at the Crystal Palace, but these are called steel cages. The cage looks like a three-dimensional steel grid, and we still utilize this method today. You can drive along, and if you see a tall structure that's using this approach being built, you can always see that steel cage. The steel cage is then further strengthened by reinforced concrete, which is concrete with steel beams embedded in it, and then the facade, or the outer wall, and the inner walls are attached to the skeleton. The structure that we see here is an early example of steel cage construction, and it's one of the earliest skyscrapers. We see that Sullivan has used simple but solid vertical lines in the design that are interrupted by horizontal lines made underneath or above the windows, as you can see here. The vertical design, though, visually is the strongest, and this emphasizes the height of the structure by encouraging the viewer's eye to be led upward. Physical movement of the eye upward registers in the brain, wow, this is a really tall structure. Sullivan's work is well known for his industrial-inspired structures that so perfectly captured the spirit of late 19th century commerce, where he combines industrial-inspired structures with beautiful ornamental detailing. Here's a detail of this upper part here. Oh my gosh, this is so gorgeous, so gorgeous. He adds decoration onto the structures so that he could connect commerce with culture to give the workplace a sense of refinement and taste. Now, one of the other things that Sullivan is very important in contributing to art history is this idea of form follows function. So basically what he's saying is that when one designs something, that you first consider the function, what it's used for, and then you design accordingly, not create a design and somehow expect the function to sort of conform to that approach. So he creates a structure that has a sense of utility because people are working there, and then he takes that functionality and then adds to it the design aspect. Now here's just a little chart for you to show you what's going on in early 20th century architecture in America and in Europe. And we're seeing some oppositional trends that are happening and some similarities that are occurring between America and Europe. Now, we have Frank Lloyd Wright, who probably is the best known American architect of all time. I personally think he is the best American architect of all time. He was known for being an advocate of handmade, high-quality furnishings for the home. And when I'm saying handmade, that means that it's a little bit of a rejection of industrialization. He was very much into functionalism, which, as we know, is an idea that Sullivan suggested, and that is that the design needs to be integrated with the function. So he's very much into functionalism. Form follows function. The design is aesthetically appealing, it looks nice, but it has a purpose. Now, this is in somewhat of an opposition to another trend in American architecture that we're going to look at, Art Deco. Art Deco has visually pleasing design, and it was very ornamental, a lot of decoration. And that this is the key here, the decoration really didn't have a practical purpose beyond simply allowing for a visually pleasurable experience. So that idea of just having stuff in there that didn't serve a function, that was something that Sullivan and Wright were not really big fans of. Art Deco was used primarily in commercial structures, which is a little bit different from Frank Lloyd Wright. He did create commercial structures, but he's really more well known for his domestic structures. Now, in Europe, they were more interested in the machine aesthetic, celebrating industry. They used mass-produced, machine-made industrial materials. They were very anti-ornamentation, so very much in contrast with Art Deco, and even to some extent contrasting with Frank Lloyd Wright as well. So they're anti-Art Nouveau, they're anti-Art Deco. And we talked about Art Nouveau in a previous lecture where we were talking about these very beautiful yet modern architectural forms that are highly organic. A lot of times when you're looking at machine aesthetic or design that celebrates industry, the organic tends to be abandoned in favor for more geometric forms. Let's take a look at what's being produced in America and Europe in the early 20th century. So we start with Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect of American architecture, and he wanted to pioneer a design style that was uniquely American, not just sort of re-articulating some design that already had been done, but something that was unique only to America. And from this desire came the Prairie style, and he did achieve this aim. This is a style of architecture that is uniquely American. So characteristics of this style are seen in the way that the structure itself is arranged with wide, flat, low proportions, just like to mimic the wide open space of a prairie, right? A uniquely American topography. So again, this includes low structures with a strong horizontal emphasis, which you can see here. What we have here, this is a cantilever, which is a long overhang that's only supported on one side. Very typical in Frank Lloyd Wright designs. You can see how that kind of gives that appearance of the low horizontality of the design. You have lots of porches and balconies that are intended to merge the structure with the surrounding landscape. And this is important. This is Wright's idea of organic architecture, unifying the inside with the out. Now, this home that we see here is considered to be one of the first manifestations of the Prairie style, having the features that I've just explained to you. We see again an interest in the topography, where Frank Lloyd Wright is taking in the surrounding natural landscape, highly typical of Wright's work, where he considers nature in terms of materials, form, and the method of construction. You can see that this structure has a lot of windows, which again function to unify the indoor and outdoor spaces. You also have with this structure the center of the home being the hearth, a reference to domestic significance. The family gathers around the center of the home, around the hearth. And this is seen in a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, where he tries to create designs that are positive and that function to benefit the family as they utilize his space. Here's another example of a Frank Lloyd Wright structure, and I wanted to bring this in to give you an example of commercial architecture. Here we have a facade, or an exterior face, that consists of heavy masonry that is edged by strong, tall pillars, which support the middle of the facade, which has been opened up to windows to allow for light. Wright wanted the structure to be tall, to have a monumental quality, which is a lot different from his low horizontal structures that we see in his Prairie designs. This structure is tall, it's heavy looking, but this is deceiving. The interior, as you can see in this other photograph, is actually quite light and airy. The windows on the exterior and the light from above come in, allowing for a lot of natural light. And this is something where the design is helping to facilitate the function of the structure, having light so it's well lit interior, helping people to see. So This idea of the light-filled workspace, this proves to be quite influential, and you can see that it will be replicated by designers of other commercial structures in later years. On the interior, you can see it in here, we have labor-related slogans that celebrated the virtues of the economy, of industry, of cooperation. Wright wanted these slogans to inspire workers so that when they would come into this light-filled interior, it was enjoyable to work, and there's all these positive motivations as well. And remember, it's kind of like the previous structure, using his design to kind of make a positive impact on the people that are utilizing his structures. The structure differs from his residential design in that it's tall and it has a bit of ornamentation, but it's also similar in that this design, as with his Prairie house designs, have a bit of a geometric emphasis. Also similar is that there's a unity between the interior and the exterior, that the heavy vertical piers on the interior, piers are these square-like columns, they are also reflected on the exterior as well. So we move now to look at another approach to architecture, and this is Art Deco. Art Deco was a successful style because, simply put, people liked public buildings that looked nice and that were pretty. We know from industrial designs of the early 1900s that it's pretty austere, it's pretty severe stuff. The aim of Art Deco in terms of architecture was to bring industrial design up to the realm of fine art by using industrial materials, not hiding the industrial aesthetic, but then sort of making things nice with decorative patterns and embellishments. Many Art Deco structures were streamlined. They used elongated forms. They were symmetrical, which was a huge part of industrial design across the board, not just with Art Deco. Streamlined forms were visually appealing. They look nice, but they're inherently functional because tapered shapes allow for the form to be aerodynamic. So that's something to consider as well. The industrial appearance, but something that also looks nice. So we have here the City Hall in Buffalo, New York, and this is a great example. And so you see, this is very typical with Art Deco, you have this emphasis on these vertical aspects of the design to give it a sense of height, but these also give it a sense of decoration as well. And then I have a detail here of this gorgeous dome that you can see here. So with the Art Deco style, it makes its appearance in 1925 in Paris at the International Exposition of Modern, Decorative, and Industrial Arts. And it's kind of like Art Nouveau in that there is some variety to the style, and that you see it applied in different ways, but yet in similar ways as well, if that makes sense. It has elegant forms, and there is at times an organic quality, although I would argue this is much more apparent in Art Nouveau. And again, ornamentation, fancy stuff, very important. Here's an example of the Chrysler Building. I just wanted to show you this quickly because this is like the most famous example of the Art Deco style. This structure was thought to be like a monument for the Roaring '20s, the time just before the Great Depression when American millionaires and the corporations that they owned competed with one another to build the most magnificent skyscrapers. Here's a detail of the top of the Chrysler Building, which you can see is built up of diminishing fan shapes, glitters in the sky, almost like this is like a crown, honoring the great achievements of the auto manufacturer Chrysler. And it's like a temple of commerce. Now here we have the Post Office Savings Bank, and this is a European structure that's located in Vienna. And I brought this in to give you an example of European art, but also because you'll be reading about this structure in your reading. Otto Wagner, his approach to architecture has been termed as New Simplicity. He believed that the architect first took into consideration the function of the building and that the form would follow naturally. And this should sound familiar to us. This sounds like form follows function, Sullivan's mantra. The result, which you can see here, is simple architectural style. You can see that there is an absence of ornamentation, not very much fancy stuff, and a very clear and undisguised use of material. The design is simple, it's practical, but there is something that's nice looking about it. It's a sense of beauty that's made by man, that man could create beauty and did not have to turn to nature to do so. Where do we see this beauty? It comes from the sense of light and air. We have some really visually pleasing linear rhythms throughout, seen in the ceiling as well as the floor. And linear rhythms just is referring to lines, the repetition of lines. The repetition of lines that we see on the floor as well as the ceiling, that similarity functions to unify the design. You have these rigid linear designs, and they are juxtaposed against slight curving forms that round out the transition from the walls to the ceiling. And I like juxtapositions of contradiction. I think it's interesting. Curve versus straight, like what we're seeing here. Very nice. Wagner believed wholeheartedly in modern engineering techniques, again, by undisguising, making clear his use of materials, and to emphasize the strength of the materials, to underline, perhaps, or reinforce the strength of the institution that's housed in the structure. So he's using these materials functionally, he's using them to celebrate industry, but he also is incorporating a little bit of symbolism in there as well. And I think that is interesting. So here's another example of new simplicity. Adolf Loos in the Steiner house. This is located in Vienna. He's the architect that also shared ideas as with Wagner, the new simplicity. Although I would argue that he was like a million times more hardcore in his application of the style and the ideas of it than Wagner was. In 1908, he wrote a treatise called Ornament is a Crime that clearly communicated how much he hated ornamentation on architecture. He said that ornamentation was a detriment to culture, that it actually signifies the degeneration of culture, that culture is moving backwards when ornamentation is used. So he's pretty anti-ornamentation. He says that ornamentation devalues labor, that you can't fully see and appreciate the product of someone's labor because it's covered in all kinds of gobbledygook. Except I think that crawling vines, that might be seen as ornamental, and that's nature's ornamentation, which is even a bigger no-no, I would think, for Loos. Again, I like the contrast. These are stark white structure set against the greenness of the plant. I am sure that Loos is rolling over in his grave, knowing that there's this type of natural ornamentation on his structure. So he's clearly embraced this sort of aesthetic purism that is certainly anti-Art Nouveau and certainly Art Deco, which we looked at a minute ago. It's clear with the Steiner house. There is no ornamentation to speak of, only seriousness and severity. Also, we see features that were found in Wagner's post office savings bank of the previous slide. You've got the simple rounded forms, a straightforward design. It's completely utilitarian and functional. We have an undisguised use of industrial material, in this case, reinforced concrete. And fun fact, this is the earliest use of the material in a private Austrian home. All right, Turbine Factory by Peter Behrens. And the reason why I brought this in is because you can see in this comparison that Behrens is influenced by Greek architecture, specifically the Temple of Hera too. And in a reading, you read about Le Corbusier and how he also is interested in looking back to Greek architectural forms for inspiration. So I brought in an additional example to show you how architects are doing this. He created this design, Behrens did, that was intended to be a glorification of industry, and it's based off of, as I said, the model of a Greek temple, where it's elongated, longer rather than wide, with columns running down the side. But here it's more like buttresses that equate to what we see here. It's symmetrical with a pediment. This is the pediment here. It's kind of a rounded like pediment structure at the front. And if we think about it, this desire that many architects have to instill a sense of symbolism into the work, what might Behrens be saying when he creates a design that's similar to that of a Greek temple? Perhaps that capitalism or industrialization, because this is a factory, is a new religion, right? Sanctity of labor and industry. And we've talked about this in many of the structures we've looked at in this lecture, this idea that these structures are meant to be temple-like, right? The Chrysler Building, a temple to commerce, the Houses of Parliament, a temple or a church-like structure related to the government. Now, equating the turbine factory to a Greek temple did go along with Behrens' ideology. He wanted to use his design to elevate the worker in line with higher cultural standards, which is interesting. That's what Sullivan was also doing. He wanted to transform labor into a dignified experience. He wanted to mold raw industry into the stuff of art, make industry artistic, and he wanted to let people know that cultural standards must be transformed if society wanted to assimilate into the new modern world. Like other architects of his time, Behrens emphasized the functionality of the structure through the materials he selected, which are clearly seen, not hidden under a bunch of fancy ornamentation. And he not only designed the structure, this is interesting, but he also designed the firm's products and packaging, which ushers in a new type of artist, one who is the industrial designer, imposing their sense of aesthetic and a whole range of machine products. I liken this a little bit to Frank Lloyd Wright, because Frank Lloyd Wright, when he created the designs, he designed the structure itself, but he also designed the furniture, he designed the interior accessories, he dictated where they should be placed. Supposedly the people that were moving into the home contractually could not move or relocate these things. It was an inherent part of the design. So much so that he would sometimes design clothing for people to wear so that they would be better integrated into the design when they're in the house. So he's kind of doing the same thing as Frank Lloyd Wright, where he's not only designing the structure, but he's designing the structure's affiliated accoutrements as well.